Hi all, it's Charlotte Appleton with Cesare Project. Today's question is, have you ever noticed that the way we approach disease today is like a war with many fronts? Every disease requires a separate line of effort to deal with that disease. This is a resource-intensive approach, and it's going to have failures because maintaining all those lines of effort means that some are not going to get the attention they need to maintain whatever degree of control is desired. In this video, I take a look at an article that came up in my media feed entitled "Science Falls Behind as Syphilis Stages Another Comeback," published in The Scientist, February 21st of 2023. This illustrates a frustration commonly seen with public health initiatives where disease loses the attention of the public and has a tendency to resurge while people are busy looking at other things. Syphilis is an ancient disease, and it's only contracted in one of two ways, either sexually or by vertical transmission, which means a mother passes it along to her fetus during pregnancy. Even though it is an old disease, and we even have a theory, germ theory, that effectively combats it, it continues to be a problem. Why is that? Let's take a look at how our multi-front war approach creates troubling outcomes. Be sure to check out the Desperate Times page. You can explore why is now the time to be thinking differently about disease. Here's the article published in The Scientist, "Science Falls Behind as Syphilis Stages Another Comeback." I found this funny because the word stages sounds like a planned operation. Treponema pallidum is the bacteria that causes syphilis, but when I look at the word stages, I imagine these little bacteria in a secret society plotting some sort of revenge. I just thought this was a funny term. Syphilis is among the oldest known sexually transmitted infections. That is true. Even in the oldest mummies, we often find evidence of syphilis infections in the past. And it really inspired a historical international game of name-calling. Shown here, the French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Russian called it the Polish disease. The Polish and the Persians call it the Turkish disease. India called it the Portuguese disease. The Tahitians called it the British disease. And on it goes. The one that's the closest was used by the English called Cupid's disease, which gets at the fact that it is sexually transmitted. Back to the article, the second sentence states, "Scientists still struggle to detect and treat it. Even though we have germ theory that effectively cures this disease, we still struggle to detect and treat it." I think that has to do with failure to understand life, because what we have here is living bacteria affecting us as humans, another larger living system, and our failure to detect and treat it indicates that we really don't understand how these living systems are interacting. When exploring an article, it's good to know who's writing it to get some background. There is no link to this author's name, though at the bottom it says Bhargavi Duveri is a fellow in global journalism at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. It was originally published on Undark. So let's go there. So here's the original publication. Undark is a non-profit, editorially independent digital magazine exploring the intersection of science and society. It's supported by funding from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. And here's their website, Knight Foundation. "We are social investors who support a more effective democracy by funding free expression and journalism, arts and culture in the community, research in areas of media and democracy in American cities and towns where the Knight brothers once published newspapers." They believed a well-informed community could best determine its own true interests and was essential to a well-functioning representative democracy. Back to Undark, it says that the name of their organization signals to readers that their magazine will explore science not just as a gee whiz phenomenon, but a frequently wondrous, sometimes contentious, and occasionally troubling byproduct of human culture. They are not interested in science communication or related euphemisms, but true journalistic coverage of the sciences. Okay, so let's find out a little more about the author. When I click on her name, it takes me to another article, but I can't find anything about her in particular. In any case, we're coming from a journalism background. Syphilis has long been difficult to eradicate. True statement. In 2021 in the United States, there were more than 171,000 cases of the sexually transmitted infection. So we're not talking about the one that's transmitted during pregnancy to the fetus. Oops, I spoke too soon. Congenital syphilis, which is when the fetus becomes infected, is a concern because it has nearly tripled in the same period. Here's a graph posted on the ABC News website that references CDC information. Starting in the 1950s, syphilis cases declined. Penicillin is an antibiotic that treats syphilis very effectively. It cures it. Alexander Fleming serendipitously discovered the antibiotic in 1928. after some time developing it and how to make it publicly available, then syphilis became less of an issue because it was curable and no longer a lifelong disease. Prior to penicillin, syphilis could be lifelong and cause innumerable problems that were a little different for everybody. It was known as the Great Masquerader because its manifestations, which could include the skin, the brain, psychosis, heart, liver, joints, anything, looked like a lot of other diseases. When the cure came out, all of those problems were easily preventable by getting rid of the disease. So here we see the decline in syphilis cases. Then there was a spike in the 80s, dropped down again, and then it is now coming back up. So despite having an effective cure, we still can't get rid of syphilis. The original article says this is not entirely new, and there continues to be cycles of rise and decline among populations. Although the cause of current resurgence is not well understood, this is what they attribute it to: condomless sex linked to new HIV/AIDS prophylactics, illicit drug use, and the proliferation of dating apps. So basically, this is just a modern spin on the fact that syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease. That hasn't changed at all. All of these listed here are newer renditions of reasons people engage in unsafe sex. Persons at risk for contracting HIV can now take prophylactic drugs to prevent getting HIV, but if they have unprotected sex, then they're still at risk of contracting other sexually transmitted disease, with syphilis being the one of interest here. Illicit drug use presumably links in some way to choosing to have unprotected sex, but not because syphilis is transmitted by IV drug use itself. And finally, the proliferation of dating apps, which I think that's just alluding to promiscuity perhaps. But all of this just comes down to something we already know, which is it's sexually transmitted. There's nothing new here. And that doesn't change the fact that it comes back to trying to control unsafe behaviors is absolutely essential to controlling syphilis in the population today. Despite being one of the oldest known sexually transmitted infections, syphilis receives little attention from researchers. That is true. I suspect that's because we have a cure for it. Despite being over 100 years old, penicillin is so effective against syphilis that it's become more of a logistics problem getting the medicine to the people who need it, not a scientific one of really understanding the disease. What I think is interesting about syphilis is that it causes multiple disease manifestations in different people. When it's left untreated, it goes on to create dozens of problems, but it's not predictable who will get which problems. In that way, I think in terms of thinking differently, syphilis offers a lot of opportunity for understanding disease in a new light, but that is not where this is coming from. Today, only a handful of labs in the world are currently working on this disease and its causative agent. Also, Treponema pallidum is really fragile. It's difficult to grow in culture and to study in the lab. Because of this fragility, the ability to develop new syphilis diagnostics, treatments, and prevention measures, such as vaccines, have been limited. Effective treatments are additionally challenging, experts say, because of T. pallidum's ability to evolve resistance to antibiotics. This one causes me to pause. So, as I mentioned previously, T. pallidum remains exquisitely sensitive to penicillin, and it is still first-line therapy. We actually don't know why it is so effective. So many other bacterial infections tend to develop antibacterial resistance, which can really complicate treatments down the road. But Treponema pallidum hasn't done that. I don't know who these experts are that this author is referencing, and the bacteria probably does have the ability to evolve resistance, but it hasn't. In fact, penicillin is so effective that if someone is allergic to penicillin, current recommendations are to use a desensitizing procedure to make that person able to tolerate penicillin to treat their syphilis. This reference to the ability to evolve resistance is inspiring fear when I don't think it's due. Left untreated, 15 to 30% of infected people go on to these permanent life-threatening conditions. Well, my question is, why isn't it 100%? That means that 70 to 85% don't go on to develop these lifelong conditions. Why is that? Super interesting. This paragraph calls for a renewed interest in studying syphilis and commenting that there's an entire generation of clinicians and researchers who may never have even seen or thought about syphilis. That just illustrates how effective our approach has been. And yes, we do get these population bumps and maybe it spikes up, but overall it is still a success story from a population standpoint. When you're fighting a multi-front war, syphilis is one of the lines of efforts that has become less important today. The main limitation of syphilis research is the inability to grow the delicate bacteria in the lab. Humans are the only natural host, though scientists have been able to infect other animals with T. pallidum. That means that there needs to be some tweaking to make it infect other creatures, which may lead to outcomes that won't necessarily work for people. It was only in the 1970s they figured out exactly what was needed to grow the bacteria in culture, and then they finally cultivated it in 1981 in the skin cells of cottontail rabbits. Is it close enough to humans? Who knows? Despite that, research still required large animal facilities and was really expensive. There were some improvements in the cell culture process in 2018. In 2021, a team of scientists used that technique in a study for which they identified an antibiotic known as linezolid as a possible syphilis treatment. Wow. Penicillin, again, is extremely effective against syphilis. Linezolid is a newer agent, and in clinical practice, we reserve it for very drug-resistant infections. If you have an infection that's sensitive to penicillin, you wouldn't drop this big gun. That's a surefire way to promote resistance, which isn't even a problem here. It denotes that some people are allergic to penicillin, which I've already addressed, and penicillin is in short supply in many parts of the world. So having alternatives is important, but linezolid wouldn't be my go-to from a clinical standpoint. While anyone who is sexually active can get syphilis, men who have sex with men are at higher risk. So the first part of this sentence isn't exactly accurate. Not everyone who is sexually active is at risk. If someone's in a monogamous relationship and neither individual has syphilis, then there's no chance of getting syphilis. It's only when that changes that the risk changes. Men who have sex with men are at higher risk. So this is specifically not talking about congenital risks. So it's 15 times more common in this demographic compared with the general population, which is important when we're doing our multi-front war with multiple diseases in order to reduce disease in a target group. The resurgence in syphilis is primarily attributed to increased cases in this high-risk population. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. When we see that big uptick, this is the population we're concerned about. So the increased syphilis prevalence, the reasons for that are complex. Again, we're back to decreased condom use because of the effectiveness of preventing HIV transmission, although linking it to that claim is inconsistent, it says. So again, complex. Other research suggests that increase in sexual partners due to dating apps as well as sexualized drug use could also play a part. So again, this is just a modern spin on an old problem. Yeah, people have been having unprotected sex since the dawn of people. Dating apps are not contributing to this change. In the men who have sex with men population, participants can take doxycycline, which is another antibiotic, as a prophylactic medicine. If they're going to have intercourse with somebody who may have syphilis, it helps protect the one who doesn't. The article mentions San Francisco's public health department rolled out this initiative in 2022 to help combat sexually transmitted diseases. And that has met some controversy and again brings up the concern about antibiotic resistance. Moving on, researchers also need to improve diagnostic tests for syphilis. We can't differentiate active versus previous infections because of the antibiotics that are created. And this is true. This is a known problem that once you have a syphilis infection, once you're cured of it, the test will always be positive. So this talks about antibodies and then moves into the idea of a vaccine. As syphilis is only transmitted among humans, an effective vaccine has potential to eliminate the disease altogether. The only case in which a vaccine has eliminated a disease entirely is smallpox, which is a virus. And they say that the vaccine would also prevent the development of antibiotic resistance in this bacterial pathogen. Progress on a vaccine has been slow. So far, just one study reported complete protection against T. pallidum in rabbits. Well, again, there's that. The study was done 50 years ago and required 60 doses of inactivated whole T. pallidum bacteria. Those poor rabbits. What this article illustrates is that modern medicine uses the art of beating a dead horse to deal with syphilis on a multi-front war with disease. What we see is the weaknesses and the inadequacy of germ theory in dealing with modern problems. Germ theory was instrumental in linking T. pallidum to syphilis and the disease manifestations it creates. In the first part of the 20th century, that led to a steep decline in syphilis cases. Now that we're seeing another uptick in syphilis, we're left grasping for straws, trying to identify behaviors to explain the finding that doesn't have an obvious source. Before penicillin, it was the lack of a cure, and in the 1980s, it was an immunodeficiency virus. We don't have anything to point our fingers at this time. This article is trying to raise awareness and is a plea for renewed interest and funding, and yet it turns to old tactics that are exhausted. Better detection of disease, use of prophylactic drugs, and these old strategies can't overcome the logistical problems that germ theory depends on identifying disease in every single individual. It also highlights that a cure simply isn't good enough. All of this talk about trying to cure disease misses the fact that cures are temporary. They're a 19th and 20th century solution to 21st century problems. Again, we find ourselves at the edge of the paradigm where we can't answer the necessary questions. Instead, we use an old strategy to single out behaviors because we believe behavior causes disease today, which ends up singling out individuals and communities that feeds into judgment, the appearance of disparities, and social problems that truthfully don't even need to exist. When we step back and recognize that germ theory isn't robust enough to deal with this problem, then we can start thinking about new ways to deal with the problem rather than getting lost in trying to make an old strategy work when it doesn't. The common trend of turning to vaccines today is also an old strategy that predates germ theory. It has had historical successes, but that we turn to it today with this notion that it's going to be a panacea, that it's going to prevent all these problems we're trying to deal with, misses that it's still laden with technical and logistical problems that make it almost impossible, if not impossible. It really is an attempt to overcome people's behaviors. We see it as the solution to protecting people from their bad decisions, but that doesn't mean it's going to get rid of disease. In fact, it won't. It's going to create new problems of a nature that we really can't anticipate at this point. The answers we need, even to deal with syphilis and other infectious diseases, aren't in the current paradigm. So let's start looking for something new. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave your comments below. I'd really love to hear from you. Have a great day.